The impenetrable Fortress Victor Hawthorne's corner office overlooked Seattle with the detached superiority of a man who considered himself above the city rather than part of it. Rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the perpetual winter he cultivated within himself. At 42, Victor had transformed Hawthorne Ventures into the most feared venture capital firm in the Pacific Northwest, known for ruthless precision and coldly logical investments. "The botanist is here," his assistant announced through the intercom, her voice carrying the subtle tone that meant she found the visitor unusual. Victor checked his Patek Philippe watch with a frown. "Send her in." The woman who entered was nothing like the polished entrepreneurs who typically crossed his threshold. Josephine Rivera, Jo, as her application had stated, wore practical khaki pants with dirt still clinging to the knees, a rumpled blouse under a cardigan with what appeared to be a small leaf stuck to the sleeve, and hiking boots that had clearly seen better days. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she carried an overstuffed messenger bag from which plant samples threatened to escape. "Mr. Hawthorne, thank you for seeing me," she said, extending a hand with soil still embedded beneath her short fingernails. "I know my research proposal isn't your typical investment." Victor barely touched her hand. "I have 7 minutes," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Explain why Hawthorne Ventures should fund botanical research with no immediate commercial application." Jo sat down, seemingly unfazed by his frigidity. "Because my work with adaptive plant genetics could revolutionize urban agriculture in climate-stressed environments. And because 7 minutes isn't nearly enough time to explain why you should invest in the future of food security." His eyebrow arched slightly. Few people challenged his arbitrary time constraints. 6 minutes, he replied. Jo opened her bag and pulled out a small terrarium. Inside was a tiny plant with unusual blue-green leaves. "This is a modified strain of Solanum lycopersicum, tomato plant, that can thrive in low-light, high-salt environments with minimal water. It produces fruit with twice the nutritional density of conventional varieties." She placed it on his immaculate desk. "I've developed 16 such varieties, but I need funding to scale the research." Victor leaned forward despite himself. "The market for specialty crops is limited. This isn't about specialty markets. It's about feeding cities when traditional agriculture fails." Her eyes met his with an intensity that momentarily disarmed him. "When, not if, climate change disrupts global food systems, these plants could be the difference between stability and chaos." Victor's fingers drummed on his desk. "Dr. Rivera, just Jo. I'm still working on my doctorate. Ms. Rivera, then. Your idealism is noted, but Hawthorne Ventures requires a return on investment within 5 years. Jo unexpectedly laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed almost alien in his sterile office. "Do you always talk like you're reading from a corporate handbook?" Victor froze. In 15 years, no one had dared to mock his demeanor so directly. "I assure you, Miss Rivera, my approach has proven effective." "Effective at what?" she challenged, still smiling. "Making money or making a difference?" Something unfamiliar stirred in Victor's chest. Irritation, perhaps, or curiosity. "Time's up," he said, standing abruptly. "I'll review your proposal further." Jo carefully packed up her terrarium. "You know, Mr. Hawthorne, plants are remarkably resilient. They can break through concrete, survive droughts, adapt to seemingly impossible conditions." She paused at the door. "Sometimes I think people could learn from them, even the ones who've built walls thicker than redwood bark." After she left, Victor stood motionless, her laughter echoing in his memory. He picked up a stray leaf she'd left behind, examining it with uncharacteristic attention. "Cancel my next appointment," he told his assistant, "and get me everything on adaptive botanical genetics." For the first time in years, Victor Hawthorne's schedule changed because of someone else's words. Seeds of change. The laboratory that housed adaptive botanical solutions was nothing like the gleaming research facilities Victor typically invested in. Housed in a repurposed warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle, it was a jungle of greenery, scientific equipment, and surprisingly, laughter. Victor stepped carefully between hydroponic systems and hanging planters, his tailored Italian suit looking absurdly out of place. 3 weeks had passed since he'd shocked his investment committee by approving Joe Rivera's funding request, a decision he still couldn't entirely explain to himself. "Mr. Hawthorne." Joe emerged from behind a wall of climbing plants, safety goggles pushed up into her hair. "You didn't mention you were visiting today." "Quarterly inspection," he replied stiffly. "Standard protocol for all investments." "Well, you're just in time for lunch," she said, pulling off her lab gloves. "We're testing some of our enhanced produce. Hope you like spicy food." Before he could protest, Victor found himself seated at a worn communal table with Joe's small team, an eclectic mix of graduate students and botanical enthusiasts, who seemed unnervingly comfortable with their benefactors. "Presents. Try this," Joe said, sliding a plate toward him. "Drought-resistant peppers with triple the vitamin content of standard varieties." Victor cautiously took a bite. The explosion of flavor caught him off guard, and he reached for water as his eyes watered. Joe laughed, that same uninhibited sound from her interview. "Sorry, I should have warned you they're potent." "You did say spicy," he managed, surprising himself with the lack of irritation in his voice. "The boss actually has taste buds," exclaimed a young researcher named Patel. "We had a bet going that you subsisted entirely on investment portfolios and the tears of failed entrepreneurs." Victor stiffened, but Joe's team erupted in good-natured laughter. "Ignore them," Joe said, passing him more water. "They've been working 16-hour days. Sleep deprivation makes scientists dangerously honest." "And what about you, Ms. Rivera?" Victor found himself asking. "Are you dangerously honest as well?" "Always," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "Life's too short for anything else." As the meal continued, Victor observed the easy camaraderie of Joe's team. They debated scientific minutiae with the same passion they discussed their weekend plans. It was messy, inefficient, and strangely compelling. Later, as Joe showed him their latest experiments, Victor noticed how she touched each plant with genuine affection. "You speak about these specimens as if they're companions," he remarked. "They are, in a way," she replied, checking the soil moisture of a peculiar blue-flowered plant. "Plants respond to care, to attention. They're constantly communicating, just not in ways humans typically notice." "That sounds unscientific," Joe smiled. "The line between hard science and intuition isn't as clear as investors like to believe. Sometimes you have to trust what you feel as much as what you measure." Victor frowned. "Feelings are unreliable data points," says the man who funded my unlikely-to-succeed project, she countered with a knowing look. Before he could respond, an alarm sounded from one of the growth chambers. Joe rushed over, Victor following instinctively. Inside, a batch of seedlings was showing signs of distress. "Environmental control failure," Joe muttered, fingers flying over a control panel. "We're losing temperature regulation." Without being asked, Victor removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "What needs to be done?" For the next hour, he worked alongside Joe and her team, moving delicate specimens to stable environments, bypassing faulty equipment, and once, when the backup generator failed, physically connecting power cables while kneeling in soil. When the crisis passed, Joe handed him a clean towel. "You've got dirt on your face," she said, gesturing to his cheek. Victor reached up, feeling the unfamiliar grit against his fingers. His $6,000 suit was ruined, his perfect appearance compromised. Yet strangely, he felt more energized than he had in years. "You didn't have to help," Joe said quietly. "Most investors would have just left and sent an email about inadequate safety protocols." "I'm not most investors," he replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Joe studied him with newfound curiosity. "No, Mr. Hawthorne, I'm beginning to think you're not." As Victor drove back to his penthouse that evening, he caught himself humming, an unconscious expression of contentment he couldn't remember experiencing since childhood. Like a persistent seedling, something was taking root within him, cracking the carefully maintained foundation of his isolated existence. He told himself it was simply the satisfaction of protecting an investment, but the soil-stained handkerchief he placed on his nightstand rather than discarding suggested otherwise. Unexpected blooms The quarterly report on Victor's desk made for grim reading. Hawthorne Ventures had just lost $30 million on what should have been a sure investment, a cryptocurrency platform that had imploded spectacularly amid regulatory scrutiny. The board was demanding explanations, heads would roll, and Victor's reputation for infallible judgment was at stake. "Cancel my appointments," he told his assistant. "I need time to formulate a response." Instead of immersing himself in damage control as he normally would, Victor found himself driving to the Adaptive Botanical Solutions Laboratory. He told himself he was checking on a vulnerable investment during a financial downturn. He ignored the voice suggesting he was seeking something else entirely. Jo was alone in the main greenhouse, singing softly to herself as she meticulously cross-pollinated flowering plants with a small brush. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, illuminating dust motes that danced around her like microscopic stars. She looked up, surprised. "Victor, Mr. Hawthorne." "Victor is fine," he said, realizing he meant it. Jo set down her tools. "Everything okay? You look like someone just told you photosynthesis isn't real." "Hawthorne Ventures experienced a significant loss," he said, the words coming easier than expected. "I needed space to think. And you came here?" Her expression held no judgment, only genuine interest. "Apparently," Jo gestured to a stool beside her workbench. "Well, you're welcome to stay. Fair warning, though. I talk to the plants when I work. They don't judge my singing voice." "Neither will I," Victor promised, settling onto the stool. For the next 2 hours, Victor simply observed as Jo worked. She explained her process, the genetic markers she was tracking, the unexpected mutations that sometimes yielded breakthroughs. Her passion was infectious, her knowledge impressive, and her occasional bursts of laughter, when experiments produced surprising results, strangely comforting. "You know what I love about plants?" Jo said, carefully recording data in her notebook. "They don't waste energy on regret. If conditions change, they adapt. If they're damaged, they grow in new directions. There's no dwelling on what might have been." Victor considered this. An efficient approach to existence. "More than efficient, it's honest," Jo replied. "The past is just compost for future growth." As afternoon faded into evening, Jo made them tea using leaves from one of her experimental herbs. The earthy, slightly sweet flavor was unlike anything Victor had tasted before. "A new variety?" he asked. "Something I've been working on privately," Jo admitted. "Chamomile base with enhanced properties for stress relief and mental clarity." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Botanical mood manipulation?" "More like botanical support," Jo corrected. "Plants have been helping humans regulate emotions for thousands of years. I'm just making them more effective for modern stressors." "Like losing $30 million? Victor said dryly. Jo's laugh bubbled up. "Exactly. Though I'd need something stronger for that level of catastrophe. Maybe a cocktail of valerian and my modified lavender." To his own astonishment, Victor found himself laughing too, a rusty, unpracticed sound that nonetheless felt authentic. "I haven't lost that much money since my divorce," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could censor them. Jo's expression softened. "I didn't know you were married." 7 years. "Ended 4 years ago." Victor stared into his tea. "Irreconcilable differences, primarily my inability to prioritize anything above work." "And now?" Victor considered the question. "Now I'm sitting in a greenhouse drinking experimental tea instead of salvaging my company's stock price. Perhaps I'm finally having the midlife crisis my ex-wife predicted." Jo's smile was gentle. "Or maybe you're just growing in a new direction." As darkness fell, they moved to the roof garden Jo had created, a verdant oasis overlooking the industrial district. String lights twinkled among native plants, and the distant city skyline glittered like a circuit board. "I come up here when the laboratory feels too confined," Jo explained, settling onto a bench made from reclaimed wood. "Reminds me why I do this work." "Which is?" Victor asked, genuinely curious. "To create beauty and sustenance in unlikely places," Jo replied. "To prove that life can thrive anywhere with the right conditions." Something about her words resonated deep within Victor, touching a part of himself he'd long ago walled off. In the soft glow of the string lights, with the scent of night-blooming flowers surrounding them, he felt a long-dormant emotion stirring, possibility. When he finally left that night, Victor carried with him a small potted plant, a hybrid Joe had developed that required minimal care but produced vibrant purple flowers. "Even you can't kill this one," she'd teased. "Just don't ignore it completely." The plant now sat on his otherwise minimalist kitchen counter, an organic anomaly in his sterile penthouse. Like Joe herself, it was colorful, resilient, and impossible to simply categorize and file away. For the first time in years, Victor Hawthorne went to sleep thinking about something other than business. The quarterly loss, temporarily forgotten, seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the unexpected growth happening within him. Winter's last stand, the board meeting had gone exactly as Victor had anticipated. Initial outrage followed by reluctant acceptance of his recovery strategy. What he hadn't anticipated was finding Gregory Winters waiting beside his car in the underground parking garage. "Hello, Victor," said his former business partner and current rival. "Heard about your cryptocurrency disaster. Shame about all that money going down the drain." Victor maintained his composure. "Gregory, still lurking in parking garages, I see. Some habits never change." Gregory's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Speaking of habits, I hear you've developed some interesting new ones. Visiting a certain botanical research facility with surprising frequency." Victor felt a cold prickle of alarm. "Monitoring my movements now? That seems excessive even for you." "Just keeping tabs on investment opportunities," Gregory replied smoothly. "And Adaptive Botanical Solutions has become quite interesting lately. Their drought-resistant grain patent application caught my attention." "They're not for sale," Victor said flatly. Gregory laughed. "Everything's for sale, Victor. You taught me that. Besides, I'm not looking to buy the company, just poach their key researcher. Ms. Rivera has remarkable talent. My offer is quite generous." The thought of Joe working for Gregory, manipulative, exploitative Gregory, who had once stolen both Victor's software patents and his fiancée, created a surge of unexpected rage. "Joe wouldn't work for someone like you," Victor said with more heat than he intended. "Someone like me?" Gregory raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone who recognizes and rewards talent? Someone who doesn't maintain emotional distance from everyone around them? We both know your reputation, Victor. The Ice King of Venture Capital." The nickname stung more than it should have. "Ms. Rivera is perfectly capable of making her own professional decisions," Victor managed. "Indeed she is," Gregory agreed. "In fact, we're meeting tomorrow to discuss her future. Just thought you should know. Friendly competition and all that." After Gregory departed, Victor sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. The thought of Joe leaving, of her vibrant presence removed from his life, created a hollow sensation he couldn't rationalize away. Without conscious decision, he found himself driving to her laboratory. It was nearly midnight, but lights still burned inside. He found Joe in her office, surrounded by research papers and empty coffee cups. "Victor!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing here so late?" He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "I understand you're meeting with Gregory Winters tomorrow." Joe's expression shifted to confusion. "The investor from Wintercorp?" "Yes, he requested a meeting." "How did you know?" "Gregory and I have history," Victor said carefully. "I felt I should warn you. His business practices are not always ethical." Joe studied him. "Are you here as my investor or as my friend?" The question caught Victor off guard. Were they friends? The concept seemed inadequate for what had developed between them over the past 3 months. "Both," he admitted. "Gregory has a pattern of exploiting promising researchers. He offers substantial funding, then gradually assumes control of their work." Joe leaned back in her chair. "I appreciate the warning, but I wasn't planning to accept his offer anyway." Relief washed over Victor. "You weren't?" "No. He called earlier today with some preliminary terms. They included exclusive commercial rights to all my research and relocating to their Texas facility." Joe shook her head. "I'm not interested in leaving Seattle or losing control of my work." Victor nodded, trying to mask the intensity of his relief. "That's good. Joe tilted her head, studying him with newfound intensity. "Victor, did you really come here at midnight just to warn me about a meeting?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty Victor wasn't sure he could provide. His carefully constructed emotional barriers, built after his parents' abandonment, reinforced during his divorce, trembled dangerously. "I didn't want you to leave," he said finally, the words falling like ice breaking from a glacier. Joe stood and moved around her desk until she was standing before him. "Why?" Victor struggled, decades of emotional suppression warring with the unfamiliar urge toward vulnerability. "Because you matter to me," he managed. "Your work, your perspective, you." A smile slowly bloomed across Joe's face. "Was that so hard to admit?" "Excruciating," Victor confessed, his lips quirking upward despite himself. Joe laughed, that same warm sound that had first cracked his defenses months ago. "For what it's worth, I'm not going anywhere. This lab, this work, these people," she paused, meeting his eyes. "They matter to me, too." Something expanded in Victor's chest, a sensation of warmth and possibility he'd nearly forgotten was possible. In that moment, in the cluttered office surrounded by the evidence of Joe's passionate work, Victor Hawthorne faced a truth he'd been avoiding for months. He was falling in love with Josephine Rivera. Before he could retreat behind his walls, Joe reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm against his, calloused from work but incredibly gentle. "Stay for a while," she said softly. "I'm testing a new night-blooming variety on the roof garden. They only open for a few hours each month, and tonight's the night." As they climbed to the rooftop sanctuary, Victor felt decades of carefully maintained emotional winter beginning to thaw. Whatever happened next, he knew with sudden clarity that there would be no returning to the frozen existence he'd once called success. The garden, within the annual Pacific Northwest Innovation Awards ceremony, was in full swing, Seattle's technology elite mingling in their finest attire beneath crystal chandeliers. Victor adjusted his bow tie, scanning the crowd with newfound patience. Once, these networking events had been hunting grounds for new investments. Now, they were merely obligations to be endured until he could return to more meaningful pursuits. "Mr. Hawthorne," called a voice he recognized as the editor of Technology Frontier. "Is it true you've diverted 30% of Hawthorne Ventures' portfolio towards sustainable agriculture? That's quite a pivot for someone known for software and cryptocurrency investments." Victor offered a measured smile. "Not a pivot, an evolution. Climate resilience represents the most significant opportunity of the coming decades. And your personal involvement with adaptive botanical solutions. I understand you're taking a hands-on approach with Dr. Rivera's research." Something in the editor's tone suggested he was fishing for gossip rather than business insights. Victor maintained his composure, though the mention of Joe's newly earned doctorate filled him with quiet pride. "Dr. Rivera's work speaks for itself," he replied. "Her drought-resistant grain varieties have already been adopted by 3 countries facing severe water shortages." Before the conversation could continue, Victor's phone vibrated with a message. The name on the screen, Joe, immediately captured his attention. "Emergency at the lab. Come quickly." Victor made his apologies and departed, leaving behind half-empty champagne glasses and puzzled competitors. 6 months ago, nothing would have pulled him from such a strategically valuable event. Now, he didn't hesitate. He found the laboratory in chaos. Water covered the floor. Electrical systems were failing, and Joe's team worked frantically to save their most critical specimens. A burst pipe had flooded the main research area, threatening years of work. "Joe!" he called, immediately removing his tuxedo jacket and rolling up his sleeves. She emerged from the back room, soaking wet and clearly exhausted. "Victor, thank God. The backup power system is failing, and we need to move the cold storage specimens immediately. For the next 4 hours, Victor worked alongside Joe and her team, his expensive shoes ruined, his tailored pants soaked to the knees. He made calls, arranged emergency equipment, and at one point found himself physically carrying delicate seedling trays to higher ground. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed. Essential specimens were secured, and emergency crews had stopped the flooding. Joe's team had departed for much-needed rest, leaving her and Victor alone in the damaged laboratory. "I'm sorry I pulled you away from your award ceremony." Joe said, pushing damp hair from her face. I know how important those connections are to your business. Victor looked at her, really looked at the woman who had so completely transformed his life. Her clothes were soaked, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and worry lines creased her forehead. Yet to him, she had never been more beautiful. Joe, he said quietly, nothing happening in that ballroom matters compared to what you're building here. She met his gaze, vulnerability evident in her expression. The board of directors called yesterday. With the flood damage, they're considering pulling our funding. They said the project is too high risk now. Victor felt a surge of protectiveness. Let me worry about the board. I can't ask you to keep investing if the financial projections don't support it, Joe insisted. I know business is business. Is that what you think this is to me? Just business? Victor asked, a note of hurt in his voice. Joe hesitated. I don't know what this is, Victor. You've changed so much since we met. But sometimes I still feel like you're holding part of yourself behind those walls of yours. The moment had come. The moment Victor had both feared and unconsciously been moving toward for months. Complete vulnerability, the final thawing of his frozen heart. I love you, he said simply. Not your research, not the potential return on investment. You, Josephine Rivera, with your inappropriate laboratory humor and your talking to plants and your absolute refusal to be intimidated by me. Joe's eyes widened, and for a terrifying moment, Victor thought he'd miscalculated catastrophically. Then she laughed, that same warm, genuine laugh that had first broken through his defenses. Victor Hawthorne, was that an actual emotional declaration? Without charts or data points? I believe it was, he admitted, feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated. Well, she said, moving closer until she stood directly before him. In the interest of scientific thoroughness, perhaps you should repeat the experiment to ensure consistent results. Victor felt a smile, a real, unguarded smile, spread across his face. I love you, Joe. Much better, she murmured, reaching up to touch his face. And since we're sharing data, I should inform you that I love you too. Despite your terrible plant watering skills and your intimidating boardroom glare, when their lips met, Victor felt the last of his emotional barriers dissolve. The kiss tasted of coffee and hope and possibility, of a future neither of them could have imagined a year earlier. Later that morning, as they sat amid the flood damage planning renovations, Joe handed Victor a small pot containing a seedling. What's this? He asked. A new hybrid I've been working on, she explained. It combines the cold resistance of Arctic flora with the vibrant blooming cycle of tropical species. Theoretically impossible, but it turns out with the right conditions, even the most unlikely combinations can thrive. Victor looked from the plant to the remarkable woman beside him. Does it have a name? Joe smiled, her eyes bright with both exhaustion and joy. I was thinking of calling it Hawthorne's Heart, scientifically terrible, but poetically fitting. As sunlight broke through the laboratory windows, illuminating the water-damaged space with golden promise. Victor Hawthorne, once known as the coldest man in Seattle's business world, felt the final winter of his heart give way to perpetual spring. The seedling between them, improbable and resilient, stretched toward the light, much like the love that had grown in the most unexpected of gardens.